Good evening. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's program. I also want to give a great shout out to the World Affairs Council Desert Cities who are extending this program to their members tonight. So welcome, and we're glad you're joining us on today's program. We have a terrific 2022 lineup of terrific live stream and in-person programming. I'll provide a brief summary at the end of today's program. It's also available on our website at lawacth.org. For those of you who would like to ask Dan questions tonight, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Claire Krelitz, our communications manager and digital producer, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which will start in about 30 minutes. It's now my pleasure to introduce the Dan Schnur Political Report with our own political professor, Dan Schnur.
Hey, Kim.
Hey, Dan.
How are you?
Happy February. Here we go.
Happy February. This monthly routine is starting to kick in, isn't it?
I love it. Well, we have so many viewers who are so eager to hear from you. So let me just tick off the two very meaty topics for you today and turn it over to you. Number one, winning the post-Cold War, Biden's challenge in a world with three superpowers. And are the US and Russia going to go to war over Ukraine? Take it away, Dan.
Well, thank you very much, Kim. And thanks to all of you for being with us for this month's program. Plenty going on, as Kim mentioned, when we first suggested this topic, the post-Cold War, there were the post-Cold War era, excuse me. We were thinking, Kim and Rachel and Claire and Jessica and I, that there's an awful lot of things to talk about under that very broad topic. We thought we could talk about China, we could talk about Iran, we could talk about North Korea, we could talk about international terrorism or trade or immigration or even COVID, given just all the issues, climate change issues that are all incredibly challenging for the US in a post-Cold War world. And I want to take just a moment and explain that terminology. The post-Cold War world, of course, commenced in the early 1990s with the fall of the Soviet Union. And we'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. And so for many years, what some referred to as quote unquote the end of history, the US appeared as a unipolar power in the world. There was no other counterbalance. Russia had, USSR had devolved, Russia had diminished, China had not yet risen. So there really wasn't a counterbalance to the United States. And through the September 11th terrorist attacks in 2001, and arguably for several years after, the United States did maintain its very unique role on the world stage. And now in this post-Cold War era, those challenges are reappearing. Most notably and most substantively in China. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But the issue of the day, at least the one on which we'll begin, is by talking about Russia, specifically as it relates to the crisis in Ukraine. Now, for months, the Russian government has been deploying what now appears to be more than 100,000 of their troops to the immediate border area just east of Ukraine, which US and NATO leaders say could be a precursor to a Russian land grab, like the one that allowed Moscow to annex Crimea back in 2014. On the other hand, though, earlier today, Vladimir Putin offered his first public remarks in over a month on this crisis. And Putin said he still hoped there could be some additional diplomatic dialogue between the United States and Russia to avoid what's beginning to look increasingly like a potential military confrontation. He said he hoped that there could be continued dialogue before any violence took place. But he also repeated his claim that it's not Russia that's causing the problem, but rather it's the United States and NATO that are increasing tensions, in part because they aren't acceding to his conditions for a calming of the waters. He said today, for those of you who haven't seen the news from earlier today yet, Putin said that America ignored Moscow's requirement that Ukraine be barred from future NATO membership, and that NATO forces retreat from its member states in Eastern Europe. We'll talk more about that in a minute as well. Putin also, though, he went a step further. He accused the United States of using Ukraine to quote unquote contain Russia. And he suggested that Ukraine might seek US help to retake Crimea, of course, the Ukrainian territory that Russia has occupied since 2014. So before we get deeper into this, into the history, into the motivations, into the challenges, let's start Claire if we can. Excuse me, let's start Rachel if we can. Oh my gosh, I still got to get used to our new team. Rachel, I'm so sorry. But before we dig into the details of the history and the motivations and the challenges, Rachel, would you mind posting the first question for our group? Okay, so this one's pretty straightforward for everyone. Who do you think is most responsible? Not completely responsible, but who do you think is most responsible for the tensions in Ukraine? Would you say one, it's primarily Russia? Second, would you say that it's primarily the US and NATO and its Western allies? Third, is Ukraine the source of these troubles? Or is it someone else? Well, Rachel, how did we do? What did our group think about this? Let's see. Wow, 96%, haven't seen numbers that high in a while. 96% believe that it's Russia that's primarily responsible for those tensions. 3% for the US, 1% for Ukraine. So let's, as I said a moment ago, let's dig in deeper. Okay, so like I said, for several months, the Russian government has been deploying what's now more than 100,000 troops on their border with Ukraine. It's also been reported just in the last few days that there are now more than 30,000 Russian troops in Belarus on Ukraine's border. Now, just to give you some sense of geography, Russia is to Ukraine's east. That's 100,000 troops. Belarus is to Ukraine's north. It's another 30,000 soldiers. If you add on to that the presence of Crimea on what is now Ukraine's southern border, and then Moldova, which is also a strong Russian ally, to the west, and what you see is that there are Russian troops or Russian allies troops to the east, west, north, and south of Ukraine. And so you can see why the people of Ukraine are getting somewhat nervous. Now, so as I said a moment ago, in exchange for removing the troops, Putin has said he's issued written demands for what he calls security guarantees to protect Russia's safety from potential Western aggression. One, as we mentioned earlier, Russia's demanding an absolutely ironclad assurance that Ukraine will not be allowed to enter NATO. And while the likelihood of that is still many years away, given internal challenges within Ukraine, it's something he wants laid out unconditionally. Also, as you heard me say, Putin wants a commitment that NATO won't further expand eastward. And that finally, and perhaps most troubling, he wants NATO and the United States to withdraw their military presence in Eastern Europe, basically back to where it was in the early 1990s, before the Soviet Union dissolved. Now, the United States, as you've read, and NATO rejected those demands out of hand. And they have leveled a series of diplomatic and military and economic threats against Russia that we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, just to try to frame this in a slightly broader perspective, we know pretty well why Putin is drawing this line in the sand over Ukraine. Putin has said many, many times, and we've talked about this on this webinar previously, Putin has said many times that he believes that the end of the Soviet Union was a historical and geopolitical tragedy. His early career was as a KGB officer in the Soviet Union, and he and many of his closest friends and allies in Russia made it very clear that they think that the United States and the West took advantage of internal Russian Soviet weaknesses and divisions to press for the end of the Soviet for the end of the Soviet Union. We also know that Putin believes that the United States, in the person of then Secretary of State James Baker, committed to Russian leaders back in 1991 that NATO would not expand to Russia's borders. Baker and the US say that that commitment was never made, but Putin thinks, or says that he thinks, that not only was the end of the Soviet Union a tragedy, but the US committed that it would not move NATO closer to Russia's borders. And that's important. Russia's borders are something that's important to Putin, not just for his own immediate geopolitical purposes, but it's probably helpful to take a somewhat longer look back into Russian history, because Putin's approach here reflects many longtime traditions of Russian foreign policy strategy that evolved almost necessity over several centuries of foreign aggression. Now, if you think about it, Russia is on this immense territory with very few formidable physical barriers, mountains, rivers, not that much to protect Russia against foreign incursions. And so Russia has historically tried to provide for its own security, number one, with very strict internal controls on their own people in order to protect against potential insurrection. And also, and this gets very relevant to the questions about NATO membership, the other way that they've provided for security over the years is pushing their borders as far as possible away from their heartland and their major populated areas. This is a country that's been invaded, as I said, many times over the centuries. And so that geographic space is something they see, and have seen for a long time, as a necessary geographic buffer. So we know why Putin is moving so aggressively. The more challenging question is why now? Well, as I said a moment ago, Putin believes the US took advantage of Russia's weakness, or of the Soviets' weakness, after the Soviet Union collapsed. And Putin wants to change the current security arrangements in Europe that he believes developed out of Soviet and then Russian weakness. But now, the reason Putin is moving now is he believes that the US is the one that's weak and distracted and divided, not Russia. And that he and Russia have a unique opportunity to force change on its terms against a divided and distracted opponent, the same way that the United States and its allies, he believes, took advantage of the Soviet Union during its time of internal discord and disarray. So again, more specifically, back in the early 90s, the US and NATO forced Russia to withdraw what was left of the Soviet military from their bases in Eastern Europe, from Germany, and from the Baltic states. And Putin, make no mistake about it, he wants the United States to suffer in exactly the same way. Now, from Russia's perspective, America's domestic challenges after 4 years of the Trump presidency, as well as the divisions and some of the mistrust that's developed between the US and its longtime allies, both during the Trump administration and during the past year as well. Putin believes that those divisions domestically and those international tensions between the US and its allies, he believed that that signaled the same kind of weakness on the part of the United States that the Soviet Union felt when it was dissolving. And if Russia pushes hard enough, Putin hopes that he can take advantage of the situation by developing a new security deal with NATO and Europe that would avoid an open-ended conflict. But that security arrangement would also require the US's withdrawal from Europe and taking our military presence with us. Now, let's talk about some of the distractions that Putin sees Biden and the United States facing. Of course, between COVID, a recession, inflation, there's all sorts of domestic policy challenges for Biden right now, as we all know. Second, more broadly, the Trump presidency and the last year have demonstrated that the enormous political divisions that have emerged in this country, not just over the policy matters I mentioned a moment ago, but culturally and socially as well, haven't gotten any better. In fact, those divisions have gotten even wider. Putin also believes that the problems that emerged during Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan increased tensions between the US and its allies. And the supposition there, as we've heard from plenty of others in the last several months, is that many of the United States' longest-standing foreign allies in Europe, in Asia, and in Latin America felt to some degree that Biden's election would indicate a return to normalcy, that America would reassert itself on the world stage the way it had for so many years previously. But there was still some nervousness because what these other countries learned in 2016 is how precarious our country's policy commitments can be when there is a change in leadership in Washington, D.C. And Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan was a reminder to a lot of our longtime allies that even though Biden is committed to rebuilding those relationships, number one, that's not always going to be the case, at least not in the most effective way. But second, it's entirely possible that the 2024 election could bring just as dramatic a change as the 2016 election did. So they're nervous about putting all their eggs in America's basket. And then finally, Putin looks at recent American history under Trump, under Obama, and under Bush. And what he has seen is an increased lack of appetite for foreign engagement and a lack of commitment on the US's part toward potential international trouble spots, a lack of commitment and follow through in Crimea, in Syria, in Afghanistan, and elsewhere. So all these distractions, all these divisions has led Putin to believe the shoe is now on the other foot. And most challenging for Biden is that Joe Biden knows, that Vladimir Putin knows, that Biden will not go to war over Ukraine. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, which means the US is not contractually obligated to defend an invasion of that country. But Biden has been identifying a number of other ways to push back short of direct US military intervention. He's sent large amounts of military equipment and ammunition to Ukraine and to neighboring countries, other countries on the Russian border and throughout Eastern Europe. Biden has also sent several thousand US troops to the region. His administration has developed economic sanctions that are unprecedented in their breadth and strength, threatening not just Russia and its businesses, but Putin himself, his closest allies, and most notably just yesterday, the Biden administration indicated that should these sanctions be put into effect, they would also be imposed against Biden's associates' children, who often travel to the United States and other Western countries to attend college and do other things. And so these are harsher steps than have been taken before. And add on to that, of course, Biden has developed and worked very hard to develop a multinational coalition to stand with the US diplomatically and economically, and to some degree militarily. So it's a lot of stuff. Second question, Rachel, if we can put it up for our group, is given the challenge that Putin is presenting, and given the options that are at Biden's disposal, how would you assess President Biden's handling of the Russia-Ukraine crisis to date? Pretty straightforward on this one. Has he been too confrontational and too belligerent? Has Biden been too deferential? Or is he hitting it just about right? What does everybody think? What do we think? What do we got, Rachel? Oh, look at those answers. 74%, 3/4 of us think that Biden is hitting it just about right. But as you've learned when we've done these polls in the past, take out that middle answer, and that's the real what's really instructive here. By a 5-to-1 margin, our group thinks that Biden is being too deferential to Putin. Very, very interesting. Now, Biden's in a tough spot. I mentioned a moment ago that the U.S. has been working hard to develop this multinational approach to the Ukraine crisis. But to be fair, to be frank, these tensions with Russia have exposed some pretty serious divisions within the NATO alliance too. As I said earlier, because Ukraine's not a NATO member, the alliance doesn't share treaty obligations with the Ukraine government and is not obligated to come to its defense. And so what that means is each of the NATO countries has its own interests in relation to Russia. And what that's done is it's caused many different opinions in recent weeks on how to best lend support. Germany's role in this discussion has been particularly notable, because Germany relies, as do many European countries, very heavily on Russia for fuel. And Germany refused a couple weeks back to allow its weapons, or allow weapons that had been manufactured within Germany, but were now owned by Estonia. Germany said, because we produce these weapons, even though they belong to Estonia now, Estonia wants to send these weapons to Ukraine and Germany forbid it. And the US, on the other hand, was offering Estonia and other Baltic countries authorization to provide military armaments. So Biden slipped up just a little bit in his news conference a couple of weeks ago when he was talking about sanctions on Russia, admitting that maybe this alliance isn't quite as closely knit as it needs to be. And if the alliance is tested as it may be over the next few weeks, we'll see to what extent the very divergent interests of different NATO countries, how those interests emerge and what they mean to the overall coordination of the effort. If you look around Europe elsewhere, you see that Boris Johnson is distracted with a scandal of his own making. Emmanuel Macron is having his own sidebar one-on-one conversations with Putin. And that threat of the cutoff of Russian oil has many European countries, not just Germany, very, very nervous. So on one hand, the West wants to be united on this one, but geopolitical realities have made it very, very difficult. At the same time, here in the US, domestically, Republicans are fighting with Biden over these sanctions. And not all Democrats are in line either. You've got plenty of senators in both parties who want to impose those sanctions against Russia now. And the White House is saying, no, let's wait and see if Russia enters Ukraine, then let's impose those sanctions. But let's punish them for action rather than preemptively acting. So let's sum this one up. Putin's goals. Putin wants to reassert Russia's relevance on the world stage. He wants to embarrass Biden, and he wants to test the unity of NATO. And if you think about it, going back to a point I was making a moment ago, he's already pretty far along on his way to achieving those ends without entering Ukraine. Putin has already dragged Biden into having to respond to all these ongoing escalations. It's distracting Biden from other diplomatic priorities, and we'll talk about China in just a minute. It's up in the political stakes for Biden at the same time that other NATO countries are standing with the US, but as I mentioned a moment ago, it's not necessarily in lockstep. So that's progress that Putin has made toward his goals. On the other hand, though, Putin is really facing some pretty serious challenges as a result of this crisis. His approach has pushed Ukraine even further away from Russia and closer to the West. The president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, was ambivalent about whether Ukraine should join NATO when he first took office. Now he thinks it's critically important. The Ukrainian public, which had been somewhat split a year or two ago on the question of joining NATO, is now overwhelmingly in favor of it. NATO and the European Union are not completely, but relatively unified in support by Ukraine, certainly much more than they were several months ago. And now you even have countries like Finland and Sweden, which have always prided themselves on neutrality, insisting that Ukraine still be allowed to join NATO at some point in the future. So on one hand, Putin's made some progress. On the other hand, he may have created some additional geopolitical problems of his own by how forceful he's been in terms of amassing the military at Ukraine's border. But I'm going to take this conversation in a slightly different direction. And Rachel, if we can put up the next question, I'd like to look ahead a little bit, because given the fact that NATO is not obligated to defend Ukraine militarily, and given the fact that the US and many other NATO countries are sending arms and ammunition to Ukraine and other Eastern European countries, the question for all of you is there a point? It says here, at what point should Biden respond to Russian aggression against Ukraine with military force? In other words, at what point are economic sanctions and further diplomatic efforts no longer worthwhile? Do you believe there is a point at which the US and NATO do need to seriously consider a more direct military intervention on behalf of Ukraine? Is it when the Russians take what is widely considered to be their likely first step, cyber warfare, interfering with the computer systems and internet functions in Ukraine? Would it be time for a Western military engagement with Russians fire missiles into Ukraine, but without any type of ground incursion? Should the US and NATO engage more directly militarily if Russian ground troops do enter Ukraine? Or for none of the above, that economic and diplomatic measures should stand and the US and NATO should not respond militarily, even in the face of this aggression? These are tough questions, but Rachel, I'm pretty interested, I know you are too, in hearing what our group has to say on this one. How did we come out? Look at that. Pretty well split. If you look at this, 31% say no military engagement regardless. And so if Russians not only interfere and engage in cyber warfare and missile launches into Ukraine, but even if Russian ground troops were to enter Ukraine, roughly 1/3 of our group says there should still be no military response from the US or NATO. Almost exactly the same number, a couple percent higher, but roughly 1/3 also of our group says it would require a Russian ground troop incursion to demand a US or NATO military response. And then smaller numbers, but not too small, pretty close to 20%, almost 1/5, think that either cyber warfare or missile attacks should be a trigger for US and NATO military defense. So very interesting, very split decision, and we'll obviously learn more about this in the weeks ahead. So I want to get to your questions in just a few minutes, but what we should do is talk just a little bit about China, because of course that's the other great geopolitical challenge for the United States in a post Cold War environment. Now, Biden has many challenges on China, and I'll speed through some of them because you're all pretty familiar with them by now. On Taiwan, on Hong Kong, on trade, and on other economic issues, and on the treatment of the Uyghurs, on human rights issues in Northwest China. Now, Biden has been attempting to combine pressure on the Chinese with outreach to keep the relationship between coming too tense and too combative. And so the next question I'd like to ask all of you is, obviously without nearly as much background as we provided on Russia, how do you think Biden is handling China so far after a year into his presidency? Rachel, thank you very much. Once again, a pretty straightforward question like we asked several minutes ago about Russia. How would you assess, and this question is a bit more specific, and we'll dig into Taiwan in just a moment, how would you assess Biden's handling not so much of the US-China relationship generally, but specifically of the potential crisis between China and Taiwan? And we'll talk more about the potential threat that Taiwan is facing after you've answered this question. For one, do you think Biden is handling that threat of potential military action as China acts in an increasingly menacing way toward Taiwan? Do you think Biden is being too confrontational? Do you think he's being too deferential? Or do you think he's hit it just right? And Rachel, I'm ready for those answers as soon as you got them. Oh, very interesting as well. Most of our group says just right, but that's not as strong a number as we saw for Russia. In fact, it's barely over half. 42%, a much larger number than previously, think that Biden is being too deferential to China. Interestingly, many, many more of you think he's being too deferential to China than to Russia. And 3% say too confrontational. So going back to what we were talking about a minute ago, the other reason that Putin thinks that now is such a good time for him to push back against the United States is he believes, with ample justification, that Biden's primary focus is now on the Pacific Rim. And while even as the crisis in the Ukraine has been developing, China's government has seemed perfectly happy to raise the stakes on their priority issues. So just last Thursday, China's ambassador to the United States issued a warning saying that the US could face military conflict with China over the future status of Taiwan. So this was the new ambassador's first interview since coming to Washington, D.C. And he talked about how Taiwan was walking down the road to independence. And then the Chinese ambassador said, and I'm quoting, quote, "If the Taiwanese authorities, emboldened by the United States, keep going down the road for independence, it will most likely involve China and the United States, the two big countries, in a military conflict," unquote. So the fact that China's ambassador to the United States, not that long after arriving in Washington, talked about the potential for military conflict over Taiwan is pretty jarring. And for understandable reasons, a threat like that didn't get nearly as much attention here in the US as it normally would have because we're so focused on Taiwan. So we're looking at Eastern Europe, but half a world away. Just a few days ago, 39 Chinese military aircraft flew near Taiwan, and it's the most recent of several such of those kinds of demonstrations over the last several weeks. And like with Ukraine, there's no formal treaty that obligates the US to defend Taiwan in the event of a war. But unlike in Ukraine, it's widely believed that the US would engage militarily, albeit as part of a multinational force, if China did begin to impose force on Taiwan. So I'm going to ask you the same question, and then we're going to go to your questions. I'm going to ask you the same question about China and Taiwan as I asked you a few minutes ago about Russia and Ukraine. So Rachel, can you put this question up? At what point should Biden respond to Chinese aggression against Taiwan, not just economically or diplomatically, but militarily? If the Chinese engage in cyber warfare and internet disabling in Taiwan, is that cause for US and allies to engage militarily? Second, if the Chinese were to fire missiles at the island of Taiwan, would that require a US and allied military response? And third, what if the Chinese government actually were to send ground troops into Taiwan? Then at that point, would a military response be necessary? Or just like 31% of you said when we asked about Russia's potential aggression into Ukraine, do some of you think that no matter what China does to Taiwan, cyber, missiles, or ground troops, that under no circumstance should the US and its allies engage? Rachel, how would you do on this one? Also, a very split decision. 26%, roughly a quarter of you, say the US should not engage militarily on behalf of Taiwan regardless. And that's a few percentage points lower than what we saw for Ukraine. 37% of you, a much larger number, believe that Chinese missile attacks should lead to a US and allied military response. Much larger number than we saw on Ukraine. 26%, about a quarter, said a ground troop incursion, and 10% think cyber warfare should do it. But before you take those numbers away, Rachel, let's combine those two middle categories. That when the Chinese, in the eyes of our group, move militarily against Taiwan, either with missiles or with ground troops, not only more than half, but 63%, almost 2/3 of our group, believes that the US should engage militarily then on behalf of Taiwan. Very, very interesting. And what that tells me is that our group, at least, is either much more, feels a much stronger link to Taiwan than we do to Ukraine, or is much more concerned about an ongoing threat from China than from Russia. The last point, and then I really will bring Claire on and we will go to your questions. But I implied for a moment ago, and I didn't mean to, that Russia and China were two entirely different challenges for the United States. But in fact, they're actually very related challenges. Because just last week, at the same time that troops were amassing on the Russian and Belarus border with Ukraine, at the same time the Chinese airplanes were buzzing Taiwan, at the same time, Russia and China were holding joint naval drills in the Indian Ocean in cooperation with Iran. And at the same time, the Russia-China relationship is solidifying on many other fronts also. Putin's relationship with China is improving very, very dramatically. And that gives Putin reason to think that China will be there to help him overcome whatever Western economic sanctions are put in place, should he make an incursion into Ukraine. And Putin and the Chinese president, Xi, have made a big show of their friendship in recent months. And on Friday, when the Beijing Winter Olympics open, an Olympic Games that Joe Biden and most other Western leaders are not attending as part of a diplomatic boycott, Vladimir Putin will be Xi's guest at the opening ceremonies of the Olympics. Make no mistake, China and Russia have a shared interest in making the United States look weak. And Russian success in Ukraine could very well prove to be a trial run for the Chinese, a potential Chinese move on Taiwan. And I have to tell you, I'd be very surprised if there hadn't been conversations about China, not only about China offering assistance, economic assistance to Russia to offset sanctions, but in addition, that the Chinese are watching the way the US and its allies handle Ukraine for clues and for guidance on whether and how they should move against Taiwan in the future. I don't suspect that either of these things are going to happen in the immediate future. The ground in Ukraine is still freezing, and of course, it's much easier to move tanks across frozen ground, and that's still a few weeks away from what I understand. And of course, with the Chinese Olympics starting this Friday in Beijing, think it's unlikely that either Putin or Xi would want to start a major row that distracted from those games. But maybe not in the next several days, maybe not in the next week or two. But on both fronts now, the US faces extraordinary geopolitical challenges in two parts of the world. Maybe not more significant challenges than we faced during the Cold War, but almost certainly more complicated. Okay, it is 20 minutes to 6 here in California. And Claire, I've kept you off screen long enough. So would you be willing to join me for the last 20 minutes or so we can get in some questions from our audience with the time that we've got left?
Absolutely. We have a ton of questions. I'm going to try to spend about half of the time remaining addressing the Ukraine, which there are lots of questions about, and then get to other political questions of all the other headlines that are happening. So let's get started. This person asks, Trump negotiated with the Taliban without involving the Afghanistan government. Why are we negotiating with Russia regarding Ukraine? Why shouldn't Ukraine be leading the negotiations with Russia for our support?
So the fact that these negotiations are taking place primarily, though not exclusively, between the US and Russia is one of the many, let's call them semi-triumphs that Putin has already established. Now, Biden and the Biden administration, Tony Blinken, Sullivan, the entire upper echelon of the Biden administration diplomatic corps and military leadership have been going to great lengths to make sure that the European Union, that NATO, and in particular the Baltic states in Ukraine have been involved and apprised of these conversations as they've gone on for many, many weeks and months. But Putin has made it very clear that he sees the United States as really the only relevant player in this regard. He doesn't see the EU as playing a particularly vital role. He has even less regard for Ukraine and the other Baltic states. And so Putin believes, I think with some justification, that it elevates him to be on a one-on-one conversation with the United States whenever possible. And although Biden recognizes the importance of making sure the U.S. allies feel engaged, particularly after how unhappy they were over the manner of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, is Putin figures Biden can talk to these other countries all he wants to, but Putin, doesn't really see the benefit in it. So if the only way to avoid military conflict is to engage in bipolar conversations rather than multilateral ones, it's certainly not Biden's ideal. As I said a moment ago, he's gone to great lengths to involve these other countries in briefing them before and after his and his representatives' conversations with Russia. But this is at least one area where Putin's insistence has won the day. Because if Biden and the United States are not willing to talk to Putin and his representatives on Putin's terms, then the conversations aren't going to take place, and they obviously need to.
So on that note, combining a couple questions here. Number one, why do European allies of the United States seem less concerned with this crisis? And then second, kind of similar, how much of the difficulty of getting our European allies on the same page as the US with Ukraine can be traced back to Trump's disdain for NATO?
Boy, two very good questions. So first of all, each NATO country, as I mentioned earlier, has a different kind of relationship with Russia. But the biggest difference between most of the European countries and the United States is that most of those European countries depend to varying degrees on Russia to help meet their energy needs. And of course, the pipeline between Russia and Germany that would bypass Ukraine has been a point of related contention in these discussions. But simply put, both because of geographic proximity and energy needs, Europe's priorities are different. They're not happy with the way Russia is threatening military action against Ukraine, but they have other considerations against which to balance it. The Eastern European countries, primarily those from the former Soviet bloc, they're very motivated. The possible exception of Hungary, and that's a separate conversation. They really do want to stand with the US toward the most aggressive pushback possible. But many Western and Southern European countries are less motivated. They're still supportive of Ukraine, just not with the same level of intensity, and that's where the tension emerges. How much of this came from Trump? Some, but like many of the other things we've talked about regarding Donald Trump over the last couple of years, Claire, Trump often represents a symptom rather than a cause, and an intensification of trends that had already been developing. So we talked earlier not just about the way the US handled the Russian incursion into Crimea, just in 2014, just before Donald Trump's presidency. But even going back further than that, Putin has been taking a measure, in my mind, of post-Cold War America and determined that we simply do not have the appetite for ongoing foreign engagement the way we just did. No question that Trump intensified the situation by damaging relationships with many of our European allies. It's become much, much harder to rebuild those relationships and regain that trust. But I think it would be a mistake to put all of the blame in Trump's lap, because this divergence of interest is something that had been developing for some time before Trump, and to some degree has been continuing even after he left office.
Always a good reminder that about Trump being a symptom and not a cause. So this next question is there any scenario in which Putin might stand down, not proceed with invasion, or what base-saving moves might help him forego an invasion?
Boy, see, and to me, that's the key question here. I don't believe that Putin wants to invade Ukraine. First of all, the combination of very severe economic sanctions and the cost of maintaining a very large military presence in hostile territory for a long, long period of time would seriously harm Russia's economy, which is not in all that great shape to begin with. It's also clear that unlike Crimea and even Georgia, where Putin enjoyed very widespread support from the Russian public, the Russian people are much less enthusiastic about military engagement in Ukraine. So my own feeling, and there's no way to know now, we'll see in the weeks ahead, my own feeling is that Putin is actually looking for ways to avoid that conflict in exchange for other concessions. He knows he's not going to get the three things he asked about that we talked about earlier. He knows that the US and NATO are never going to commit to exclude Ukraine now and forever. He knows that the US and NATO are not going to withdraw their military presence completely from Eastern Europe. But the US has indicated that they're willing to have conversations with Russia about missile deployment, about joint coordination and warnings, a lot of the things that have happened between the two countries in the first years after the end of the Cold War. And so I think it's entirely possible that Putin will take as much as he can get short of those three demands. That involves a much smaller Western presence in Eastern Europe and a very dramatically reduced US presence, not just in Ukraine, but in the surrounding countries. I think he gets as much as he can in terms of US backsliding, for lack of a better term, or as I said earlier, a diminishment of the US presence in that part of the world, and claims victory. So I think, to sum up, that Putin may be using Ukraine as a means to a broader geopolitical end, as opposed to the takeover of Ukraine itself being his primary goal.
This next question asks, in the midst of all this chaos, especially if it continues to progress, do you think that China would ever pull their treasury bills to cripple the US economy?
I don't think so. I mean, it's impossible to say never, because it's impossible to predict what kind of state of belligerence might develop. We talked earlier about a potential military engagement over Taiwan, but I think it's extremely unlikely, Claire, and the main reason for that is because unlike the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, the US and Chinese economies are so tightly interwoven that that kind of economic pullback from China would be devastating to the West, but it would also cause real disruptions in their economy. And just as Russia is facing economic challenges, as I mentioned a little while ago, China is facing real problems too, not just economically, but demographically. Its birth rate is dramatically lower. Its dependence on foreign energy reserves is much, much greater. There's been all sorts of problems in China's real estate market, which has caused just immense loss of wealth. So it's difficult to see. It's not impossible, but it's difficult to see China is deciding to impose that kind of economic pain on the United States, if only because of the blowback that would come to their own economic needs.
Thank you. I know this was a huge topic to cover, especially with all the headlines about what's happening. But you've really done a great job making it more concise and taking us in all kinds of interesting directions. So now,
no one has ever accused me of being concise before, Claire, but thank you very much.
Concise given the magnitude and the complications of all that's going on. But moving on to some other headlines. A lot of questions about the Supreme Court and Biden and what's going to happen. So, Dan, if you could just share maybe your initial thoughts about the Supreme Court vacancy and what our audience should be paying attention to in the coming weeks.
Okay. Well, first of all, Claire, if we didn't send it around, we should send to our audience the column I wrote this week about Biden's Supreme Court nomination. So I'd make 3 quick points. Number one, the ideological makeup of the court is not going to change. There is a 5-3-1 split on the court now. 3 liberal justices appointed by Democratic presidents, 5 extremely conservative judges appointed by Republican presidents, and John Roberts, who's sort of staked out the center right in a somewhat lonely way, trying to fashion coalition and consensus whenever he's able. It was 5-3-1 before Breyer announced his retirement, and it will be 5-3-1 after his successor is sworn into the bench. But that said, Biden's nomination and that nominee's confirmation could have a really significant effect on this year's midterm elections. As we've talked about many, many times before, Biden's greatest challenge, particularly in a midterm election that is more dependent on turning out a party's base than winning over new converts, is Biden has really been struggling to motivate the progressive base of the Democratic Party. That's why he spent so much time last month talking about voting reform and voting rights, knowing that even though he couldn't possibly pass those bills, he had to remind the party's base that he was willing to fight for them. And so, assuming that Biden will follow through on his commitment, and I can't imagine why he wouldn't, assuming Biden follows through and nominates the first African-American woman in the nation's history to the Supreme Court, that has the potential to energize the Democratic base, not just African-American women, but voters of color and other progressives across the board, and motivate them in a midterm election year in a way that has not been the case. And if you combine that with the Supreme Court's announcement on what it plans to do with the Mississippi law on abortion, and at least a potential overturn of Roe versus Wade, the two combined could motivate Biden's base in a way that Biden himself would has not seemed to be able to. So as far as the court itself, not much of a change, but the political landscape that surrounds the court could be very significantly affected by the nomination of a new justice.
Thank you. This next person says, in The Atlantic yesterday, George Packer called the pullout of troops in Afghanistan Biden's Saigon. Do you agree with this parallel?
I do, and I don't say that to be harsh in criticism of Biden, but rather to draw another parallel to which Packer alluded. And for those of you who are able, George Packer wrote a 20,000-word scathing piece in the Atlantic about the U.S.'s role in Afghanistan over the last 20 years, longest piece that Atlantic has run in many years on any topic. And it's a long, long, long read, but it's a pretty good one. But what Packer alludes to, but I would reinforce somewhat more strongly, is that Biden does not bear sole or even primary responsibility for Afghanistan any more than any single American president bears responsibility for Vietnam and the evacuation of Saigon. Both of these were geopolitical and human tragedies that evolved over not just years, but decades under many presidencies. And just like the United States under Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford struggled with Vietnam in very different ways. The United States under Presidents Bush and Obama and Trump and Biden struggled just as profoundly. Both were tragedies, but both were shared responsibilities of multiple presidents. Biden was the last one, and ironically, the American public is very, very strong in its support of Biden's decision to withdraw. That is very critical in the way he chose to do it. But ultimately, he ends up getting much more criticism for this than any of his three predecessors, because Bush and Obama and Trump, in different ways at different times, really minimized the level of awareness that most Americans had over Afghanistan. Biden, ironically, by choosing to pull out, shined a spotlight on his own action, and so he will be judged harshly. But this is a collective responsibility, just as was the fall of Saigon.
Thank you. This next person asks, there seems to be a subtle yet growing pushback within the GOP against Trump. Do you think Trump's support is still necessary for Republican candidates in the 2022 midterm elections?
I don't think Trump's support is necessary for Republicans to succeed in the midterm elections. And we're already seeing some evidence in House and Senate races around the country where Trump is supporting a candidate who's has not necessarily become the automatic frontrunner. In the Alabama Senate race, for a brief time in Pennsylvania, in Arizona, and other places around the country, we're seeing Trump's endorsement having a tremendous motivating effect on some Republican voters, but not to the same breadth as it did 2 years or 4 years ago. Trump is still by far the most dominant force in the Republican Party. No question about it. Second place isn't even close. But I do believe that Trump's hold on the Republican Party is not nearly as strong in 2022 as it was when he left office 2 years ago. And there's polling that shows that while he still has a size of a lead in hypothetical polling for the 2024 nomination, that lead is not nearly as large as it was even a few months ago. And more Republicans, a majority of Republicans now say that even those Republicans who support Trump, many do not think he should run for president again. So he'll still have a very strong impact on the midterms, but not quite as conclusive as the questioner suggested or as might have been the case in the past.
Thank you, Dan. So we're right at the end of the hour, but I'll just ask one final question. So what issues do you think will decide the 2022 elections, and particularly whether the Democrats will be able to retain their power?
The three issues that will decide the elections, I think more than any other, are the economy, inflation, and COVID. The one thing that could upset that apple cart is the Supreme Court, as we've talked about previously, chose not just to restrict the availability of abortion in this country, but rather to completely overturn Roe versus Wade. And that could and would, I believe, elevate abortion to the same level as the economic and COVID concerns I mentioned a moment ago. History is certainly on the Republican side. There's only been 2 midterm elections in the last 50 years in which the president's party gained seats in a midterm election rather than losing them. The number of Democratic retirements, particularly in the House of Representatives, suggests that a lot of Democratic members have concluded that their party is not going to keep the majority. But for those of you, I know we have a few Democrats in our group. the fact that reapportionment has gone much better for Democrats than had been predicted, the fact that Trump, even with less influence, is still pushing candidates for the Republicans who may be less electable in general elections, and most importantly, because of the wild card of the Supreme Court's decision on that Mississippi abortion case. While I think it would be hard to say that Republicans aren't strong favorites to regain their majorities, I think you have three good reasons there on why Democrats should still have a very considerable amount of hope heading into these midterms.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. As always, there were tons of questions that we didn't have the opportunity to answer, but what we did last month was we selected a few questions that we didn't get to answer, and we actually, Dan and I, recorded a little video that we released after about mid-month. So we'll look for a few questions to pick out this week that we didn't get to answer, and make sure that you look out on email for that recorded session in the middle of the month.
And that's exactly right, Claire. On one hand, what we've learned after a couple months of monthly programs is because we're taking on bigger issues, for me, better or worse, taking more time out of the hour than I had last year in order to address those issues in the depth and breadth that I think our audience deserves. But I think those videos that we've done have been really helpful, and I'd really encourage our audience to check them out. And once you've seen them, with Claire and I addressing questions that you've raised as part of this webinar that we didn't have a chance to address tonight, we hope you'll watch those, and we hope you'll send us feedback, which we can continue to address going forward.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Claire.
Claire, terrific job. Thank you. Dan, this was phenomenal. And we're always trying to find additional ways to provide our audience with more Dan Schnur. So everybody mark your calendars for March 1st. The Dan Schnur Political Report will be back, same time, 5 to 6 p.m. And for those of you who want even more, let's tell them about your post program, Dan, that we're going to in just a few minutes.
Well, not only are we going to do our post program, the next 30 minutes with a smaller, more select group of participants who, instead of writing their questions, will engage in actual conversation with you and me, Kim. But also, let's take a minute and remind our audience, at least those who are in Southern California, that starting 2 weeks from tonight, we'll be inaugurating our series on the LA mayor's race. On February 15th, I'll be interviewing City Council member Joe Buscaino. In March, we already have City Attorney Mike Fuhrer set, and we are in the process of nailing down both Councilmember Kevin DeLeon and Representative Karen Bass for programs in April and May. So in addition to these webinars, we'll be talking to all the men and women who might be mayor, or many of the men and women who might be mayor of Los Angeles come November. We hope you'll join us for that too.
Absolutely. And Thursday this week, we have a very appropriate continuing discussion on the U.S. response to the Russo-Ukrainian crisis with a terrific panel from the Department of State and the RAND Corporation. And then on the 8th, we have the new world of work, how everything has changed post-COVID, with Kian Gohar, who's a former director of the X Prize Foundation, and Renee Frazier, the CEO of Frazier Communications. So please go to our website at lawacth.org and register today, and we look forward to seeing you Thursday. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dan. See you in a minute.